Andrew Collins had everything: power, wealth, a name that commanded respect. But nothing in his carefully controlled world could have prepared him for what he saw that night. The soft hum of conversations faded, the elegant art exhibit around him blurred into nothing, because standing just a few feet away was her. Melissa. The woman he had walked away from years ago. But it wasn't just her presence that sent a shock through his system. In her arms, clutching a small stuffed rabbit, was a little girl with dark curls and piercing blue eyes, his eyes. Andrew Collins stepped into the grand exhibition hall, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. The soft hum of conversations blended with the delicate background music, creating an atmosphere of quiet sophistication. Art had always fascinated him, though in recent years, he had little time to indulge in such interests. His life revolved around billion-dollar deals, board meetings, and constant expansion. The fast-paced world of business left little room for anything else. Tonight, however, was an exception. His company had sponsored this exhibition, and attending was not just a social obligation, it was a rare opportunity to step outside his usual routine. He moved through the gallery, hands in his pockets, his gaze drifting from one painting to the next. The vibrant strokes of color, the play of light and shadow, everything here was a world away from spreadsheets and contracts. He had almost begun to relax when something, or rather someone, caught his attention. A woman stood across the room, her back to him. Dark brown hair cascaded down her shoulders, her posture straight yet relaxed. There was something achingly familiar about her, something that tugged at memories he had buried deep. His heart gave a sudden, uneven beat as realization struck. Melissa. He hadn't seen her in 5 years. Not since the night they had argued, not since they had walked away from each other, choosing different paths. He had assumed she moved on, just as he had tried to. But seeing her now, standing just a few feet away, sent a shock through his system. And then he noticed something else. She wasn't alone. In her arms was a small child, no older than 4. The little girl had soft, dark curls framing her delicate face, and when she turned slightly, Andrew's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes. They were a brilliant shade of blue, the exact same color as his own. His pulse pounded in his ears as he struggled to process what he was seeing. A million questions stormed through his mind, but none formed into words. He felt frozen in place, his carefully controlled world cracking at the edges. Before he even realized what he was doing, he took a step forward. Then another. The noise of the exhibition faded into the background, drowned out by the rushing sound of his own heartbeat. Melissa. His voice came out quieter than he intended, but she heard it. She stiffened. Slowly, she turned, her brown eyes widening as they locked onto his. For a moment, she simply stared, as if unsure whether he was real. Then, her arms instinctively tightened around the little girl, pulling her closer. Andrew. Her voice was barely above a whisper, laced with something he couldn't quite identify. Surprise? Fear? Guilt? His gaze flickered from her face to the child nestled against her shoulder. The little girl peeked at him with curiosity, her striking blue eyes full of innocence. His stomach twisted with a feeling he couldn't name. Who is she? The words left his lips before he had time to think. Melissa hesitated, her fingers unconsciously smoothing the fabric of the child's dress. She glanced around, as if looking for an escape, but there was none. This isn't the place to talk, she said, her voice steadier now. But Andrew wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. Melissa, he said, his voice low, filled with something dangerously close to desperation. I need to know. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering courage, then opened them again. There was a sadness there, a hesitation that only made his chest tighten further. Her name is Sophia, she finally said, her voice barely audible. And, she's your daughter. The world tilted. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, as if he had stepped into a reality that wasn't his own. Everything around him faded, the murmurs of the crowd, the distant clinking of glasses, the soft notes of a piano playing in the background. There was only Melissa, and the little girl in her arms, staring at him with his own blue eyes. Andrew felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. His daughter. The words echoed in his head, repeating over and over, yet they still didn't seem real. He stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the small child in Melissa's arms. Sophia. His daughter. The realization sent a shockwave through his entire being. A part of him wanted to question it, to demand proof, but deep down, he already knew. He didn't need a DNA test or a long explanation. He could see it in her face, in the deep blue of her eyes that were identical to his own. Melissa shifted uncomfortably under his intense gaze, tightening her hold on Sophia as if she were afraid he might try to take her away that very moment. She looked like she wanted to say something, but her lips remained pressed together, as if she was bracing for whatever came next. Andrew struggled to find his voice, but when he finally spoke, his words came out more broken than he intended. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was hoarse, filled with something between disbelief and quiet anger. He wasn't shouting, but the intensity in his tone made Melissa flinch slightly. She let out a shaky breath, her fingers gently stroking Sophia's curls, a movement that seemed almost subconscious. "Because you left, Andrew," she said, and there was no malice in her voice, only a quiet pain that cut deeper than anger ever could. "You chose your career. You chose your company. I tried to hold on, but you kept slipping further away, until one day, I realized I was holding on to nothing." Her words stung, because they weren't untrue. He had been the one to push their relationship to its breaking point. He had told himself he was doing it for them, for a future he wanted to build, but in reality, he had been chasing something he could never quite catch. He had convinced himself that love could wait, that there would always be time to fix things later. But later had never come. Instead, he had lost her, and now he was standing in front of a child he had never known existed. His eyes flickered to Sophia again. She was still watching him, clutching a small stuffed bunny in her tiny hands. She didn't look afraid of him, just curious, as if she was trying to understand who this strange man was and why he was staring at her like she was the most important thing in the world. His chest tightened with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite untangle. He had missed everything, her first words, her first steps, her laughter, the way she probably curled up in bed when she was scared. He had missed 4 years of her life, and the weight of that loss pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. "You should have told me," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "You should have given me a choice." Melissa's eyes flashed with something unreadable. "A choice?" she repeated, almost to herself, before looking directly at him. "Do you honestly think you would have made a different one back then? Do you think you would have dropped everything and come back for us?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to swear that he would have done whatever it took to be there, to be the father Sophia deserved. But could he really say that with certainty? The Andrew from 5 years ago had been reckless, obsessed with success, blind to everything but his own ambition. He had believed he was doing the right thing, that the sacrifices he made were necessary, even when those sacrifices had included Melissa. Could he truly say that he wouldn't have treated Sophia the same way? His silence must have given her the answer she already knew, because she let out a soft sigh and shook her head. "I didn't keep her from you to punish you," she said after a long pause. "I was scared. I didn't know how to reach you anymore. And I wasn't going to beg you to love a child you never knew existed." Her words cut through him like a blade. She had thought he wouldn't want their daughter. She had thought he would see Sophia as an inconvenience, as something that didn't fit into the life he had chosen for himself. And maybe, once upon a time, she would have been right. The thought made his stomach churn with guilt. He had never imagined himself as a father, never pictured what it would mean to have a child who looked at him with trust and expectation. But standing here now, looking into Sophia's innocent blue eyes, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wanted her in his life. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I can't change the past," he said, his voice rough but firm. "But I can change the future. I want to be in her life, Melissa. I don't know how, but I will find a way. I won't walk away from her." Melissa studied him carefully, as if searching for any sign of hesitation or empty promises. She had been hurt before, and he could tell she wasn't going to let him back in easily. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting their daughter. And she had every right to. "You say that now," she said slowly, "but what happens when your company needs you? When another deal, another project, another expansion pulls you away? Will you still choose to be here, or will you make the same decision you did before?" Andrew clenched his jaw, knowing she had every reason to doubt him. But this wasn't 5 years ago. He wasn't the same man who had put everything else above the people who mattered most. He had already lost too much, and he refused to lose anything more. "I don't have all the answers yet," he admitted, because lying to her wouldn't get him anywhere. "But I swear to you, Melissa, I will not abandon her. I will not be an absent father." A small, unsure voice suddenly broke the tension. "Mommy?" Both Andrew and Melissa turned to Sophia, who was looking up at her mother with wide eyes. "Is he my daddy?" she asked in a voice so soft and innocent that it nearly shattered him. Melissa hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes, baby," she said gently. "He's your daddy." Sophia looked at Andrew again, tilting her head slightly as if trying to make sense of it. Then, to his complete shock, she reached out a small hand toward him. He stared at it, frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Carefully, almost afraid she might pull away, he extended his own hand and let her tiny fingers wrap around his. Her skin was soft, warm, delicate. She gave his hand a tiny squeeze, as if testing to see if he was real. And in that moment, something inside him shifted, something deep and irreversible. "Hi, Daddy," she said shyly. Andrew swallowed the lump in his throat and forced himself to speak past the overwhelming emotion threatening to choke him. "Hi, sweetheart." Sophia smiled, a small, timid thing that made his heart ache in ways he never thought possible. And just like that, he knew. No matter what it took, no matter how hard it was, he would fight for her. For them. Because some things, once lost, should never be lost again. Andrew could still feel the warmth of Sophia's tiny fingers wrapped around his own long after she had let go. The moment had been brief, just a few seconds, but it had changed something deep inside him, something he hadn't even realized was missing. It was as if, in that small gesture, she had unknowingly tethered him to her, binding them together in a way that was irreversible. He had spent his entire life chasing things that seemed important: success, wealth, power, but nothing had ever made his chest tighten the way it had when his daughter had looked up at him and called him Daddy. Melissa watched him cautiously, her arms protectively wrapped around Sophia as if preparing herself for whatever came next. He could tell she was waiting for him to react, to process the reality of what he had just learned, but truthfully, he was still struggling to grasp it himself. He had walked into this exhibition expecting nothing more than an evening of polite conversation and art appreciation. Instead, he had been confronted with a truth so monumental that it made everything else in his life seem small and insignificant. His daughter. He had a daughter. A little girl he had never known about, whose entire existence had been kept from him. And yet, despite that, she had smiled at him. She had reached for him. She had accepted him with a quiet innocence that made his heart ache. He turned back to Melissa, his voice quieter now, the initial shock beginning to settle into something heavier. "How long have you lived here?" he asked, realizing that he had no idea where she had been all these years. When they had parted ways, she had still been in San Francisco, but now, here she was in New York, attending an exhibition he had helped sponsor. Had she moved here long ago? Had they been living in the same city for years without him even knowing? Melissa hesitated for a moment before answering. We moved here 3 years ago, she admitted, shifting Sophia in her arms. I got a job offer at a publishing house. It was a good opportunity, and I wanted a fresh start. A fresh start. The words stung more than he expected them to. It was proof of just how far she had gone to build a life without him. He had always assumed that if she ever needed anything, she would reach out, that if she had wanted to, she could have found a way back to him. But she hadn't. She had chosen to move forward, to create a life for herself and their daughter without him. And he couldn't blame her. Did you ever think about telling me? He asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. Even once. Melissa sighed, running a hand through her dark hair as she looked away. Of course I did, she said, her voice softer now. There were so many nights I stared at my phone, wondering if I should call you. But then I'd remember the way you left, how you threw yourself into work, how you barely even had time for me back then. And I'd convince myself that it was better this way. That you had made your choice, and I had to make mine. Andrew exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. He wanted to argue, to say that she should have given him the chance to choose for himself, but deep down, he knew that the man he had been back then might not have made the right choice. It was a painful truth, but it was the truth nonetheless. His gaze flickered to Sophia, who was now resting her head against Melissa's shoulder, her small fingers playing with the hem of her mother's sleeve. She looked sleepy, her little body relaxed, trusting. He wondered what she knew about him, if Melissa had ever mentioned his name before tonight. Did she know that her father had been absent not because he had abandoned her, but because he had never been given the chance to be there? Did she even know to miss him? I don't want to disappear from her life, he said finally, his voice steadier now. I can't change the past, Melissa, but I can be here now. I can be her father. Melissa looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. Being her father isn't just about saying the words, Andrew, she said quietly. It's about showing up. About being consistent. About proving to her that you won't leave when things get hard. Her words stung because they were a direct reflection of who he had been before. He had never been the kind of person who stayed in one place for long, never been the type to slow down. He had built his entire life around movement, around constant progress, around never settling for anything less than the next big thing. But standing here now, looking at the little girl who shared his eyes, he realized that there was something far more important than anything he had spent his life chasing. I know, he said, and for the first time in a long time, he meant it. I'm not going anywhere. Melissa studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. He could see the battle happening in her eyes, the part of her that wanted to believe him, and the part of her that was afraid to. He had already let her down once, and she wasn't about to let him do the same to Sophia. I need time, she said finally. To figure out how this is supposed to work. To know if you're serious. Andrew nodded. Take all the time you need, he said. But just know that no matter what, I'm not giving up. Not on her. Not on you. Melissa blinked, as if surprised by his words, but she didn't respond. Instead, she adjusted Sophia in her arms and exhaled softly. I should get her home, she murmured. It's late. Andrew felt a pang of disappointment, but he knew this wasn't something he could rush. Can I see her again? He asked, his voice careful. Melissa hesitated but then gave a small nod. We'll talk, she said simply. I'll figure out a way for you to spend time with her. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. As she turned to leave, Sophia lifted her head slightly, her sleepy blue eyes blinking up at him. For a brief moment, she just looked at him, as if trying to memorize his face. Then, to his surprise, she gave him a small, drowsy smile. Bye, Daddy, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew's heart clenched so tightly he could barely breathe. "Bye, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough with emotion. As Melissa carried her away, Andrew remained standing in the middle of the exhibition hall, watching until they disappeared through the doors. He had walked into this evening expecting nothing more than polite conversation and an evening of art. Instead, he had found something he never knew he was missing. He had found his daughter. And no matter what it took, he wasn't going to lose her again. Andrew sat in his office, staring out the window at the New York skyline, but for the first time in his life, the view held no meaning for him. The city that had once felt like a symbol of everything he had worked for, everything he had built, now seemed distant, almost irrelevant. His mind was elsewhere, stuck in the moment when Sophia had sleepily looked up at him and said, "Bye, Daddy." The words played over and over in his head, along with Melissa's cautious expression, the silent warning in her eyes that told him she was waiting for him to prove himself. For years, he had thought he had everything he needed. He had power, wealth, and a company that bore his name. But now, sitting here in a leather chair that had once felt like a throne, all he could think about was how much he had missed. He had a daughter, a little girl who had lived 4 entire years without knowing him, and the weight of that realization settled heavily on his chest. There was no changing the past, no undoing the years he had lost, but there was still time to change what came next. His fingers tapped restlessly against the desk as he glanced at his phone, willing it to ring. Melissa had said they would talk, but she hadn't given him a timeline, and the waiting was unbearable. He had never been good at waiting. His entire life had been built around action, around making things happen, yet now he was at the mercy of someone else's decision, and it left him feeling powerless in a way he wasn't used to. Just as frustration began to settle in, his phone vibrated against the desk. His heart jumped as he grabbed it, only to feel a mix of relief and nervousness when he saw Melissa's name on the screen. Taking a steadying breath, he answered. "Melissa," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the way his pulse had quickened. "Hey," she said, her tone measured. "I've been thinking about what you said. About wanting to be in Sophia's life." Andrew sat up straighter, his grip tightening around the phone. And I'm willing to try," she said, though there was hesitation in her voice. "But I need to be sure that this isn't just a passing thing for you. That you won't get busy and disappear when things get complicated." Andrew exhaled slowly, pressing a hand against his forehead. "I get it," he admitted. "You have every reason to doubt me. But I swear to you, Melissa, I'm not the same man I was before. I know what I want now, and that's to be there for her. For both of you." There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet sigh. "Okay," she finally said. "Then let's start small. I want you to meet her properly, in a setting that doesn't overwhelm her. Maybe we can go to the park this weekend. Somewhere familiar to her." Relief flooded through him so quickly that he almost closed his eyes. "I'd love that," he said, meaning it more than anything he had ever said before. "Thank you, Melissa. For giving me this chance." "Don't thank me yet," she said, a small trace of her old sharpness returning. "Just show up." The call ended, leaving Andrew staring at his phone, his mind already racing with thoughts of how he was going to make this right. The weekend couldn't come soon enough. When Saturday finally arrived, Andrew found himself standing at the entrance of a quiet park, gripping a cup of coffee in one hand while the other nervously tapped against his leg. He had spent the entire morning trying to figure out what to wear, what to say, how to act. He had given boardroom presentations in front of hundreds of people without breaking a sweat, but now, as he waited to see his daughter, he felt a nervousness unlike anything he had ever experienced before. Then, he saw them. Melissa walked toward him, dressed casually in jeans and a soft sweater, her dark hair pulled back. But his eyes immediately fell to Sophia, who was holding her mother's hand, her tiny legs taking quick steps to keep up. She was wearing a light blue jacket, her dark curls bouncing with each step. She looked so small, so fragile, yet there was an energy to her, a spark of life that made his heart tighten. Melissa stopped a few feet away, giving Sophia a gentle nudge. "Remember what I told you, sweetheart? This is your daddy." Sophia hesitated for only a moment before lifting her bright blue eyes to his. "Hi, Daddy," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of shyness. Andrew crouched down to her level, his chest tightening at the way she looked at him, as if trying to figure out if he was real. "Hi, Sophia," he said gently. "It's really nice to see you again." She glanced at her mother as if checking for approval, then took a small step closer. "Mommy said we can play today." His lips curved into a smile. "That's right. We can do whatever you want." She seemed to consider this for a moment before looking up at him with serious eyes. "Do you know how to push on the swings?" Andrew let out a small laugh, feeling something inside him soften. "I think I can figure it out." Sophia nodded, apparently satisfied with his answer, and reached out a small hand. For a split second, he didn't move, too stunned by the gesture, but then he gently took her hand in his own. It was so small, so warm, and he had never felt anything more precious in his entire life. Melissa watched them with a quiet expression, as if she, too, was trying to process this moment. Then she gave a small nod, more to herself than to him, and motioned toward the playground. "Let's go, then." As they walked toward the swings, Andrew realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about work, about deadlines, about anything other than this moment. For the first time, he wasn't planning his next move or thinking 5 steps ahead. He was simply here, in the present, holding his daughter's hand. And nothing else had ever mattered more. Andrew had never considered himself the sentimental type. He had spent most of his life avoiding attachments, keeping emotions at a safe distance, and focusing on the things he could control: his business, his success, the next step on the ladder he had been climbing for as long as he could remember. But all of that seemed insignificant now as he stood in the park, watching Sophia giggle as she swung higher and higher, her curls bouncing in the wind. He had been pushing her for nearly 20 minutes, and every time he thought she might want to stop, she would throw her head back and laugh, telling him, "Higher, Daddy," as if she trusted him completely to keep her safe. The weight of that trust settled deep inside him, and for the first time in his life, he wanted nothing more than to live up to it. Melissa sat on a nearby bench, watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read. She hadn't intervened once, letting them figure things out on their own, but he could tell she was still cautious. He didn't blame her. He had walked back into their lives after 4 years of absence, expecting to somehow earn a place in their world. That wasn't something that could happen overnight. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a few visits to the park or a handful of shared moments. He knew it would take time. But for once, he wasn't impatient. He was willing to fight for this, for her, for them. Eventually, Sophia let the swing slow down, dragging her feet against the ground to stop herself completely. She turned in the seat, looking up at him with those big blue eyes that had already become his weakness. "Can we get ice cream now?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, her voice filled with hope. Andrew glanced at Melissa, silently asking for permission. She hesitated for only a moment before giving a small nod. "Just 1 scoop," she said, her voice light but firm. "And nothing too sugary, or she'll be bouncing off the walls for the rest of the day." Sophia beamed, hopping off the swing and reaching for Andrew's hand without hesitation. The simple act nearly floored him. Just this morning, he had been a stranger to her, a name she had only recently learned to associate with something real. But now, she was trusting him, choosing him, in a way that filled his chest with something too big to name. They walked together to the small ice cream stand near the playground, where Sophia pressed her face against the glass display, her breath fogging up the surface as she studied the flavors. "Chocolate," she finally declared, as if it were the most important decision she had ever made. "With sprinkles." Andrew smiled, nodding to the teenage girl behind the counter. "1 chocolate with sprinkles, please," he said, then glanced at Melissa. And for you? Melissa shook her head. I'm fine. Andrew raised an eyebrow. Come on, it's ice cream. Nobody says no to ice cream. Melissa sighed, but there was the smallest hint of a smile on her lips. Fine. Vanilla. Andrew ordered for both of them, then paid before Melissa could argue, handing Sophia her cone and watching as she took her first enthusiastic lick, smearing chocolate all over her mouth. He chuckled, reaching for a napkin and gently wiping her chin. Messy eater, huh? Sophia giggled, licking her lips. Mommy says I have to be careful, but I always forget. Melissa shook her head with an affectionate sigh. That's an understatement. They found a nearby bench and sat together, Sophia happily eating her ice cream while swinging her legs. Andrew glanced at Melissa, who was quietly eating her vanilla cone, her gaze occasionally flickering toward him, as if she was still trying to figure out what to make of him. He knew they weren't anywhere close to being okay yet, but this moment, sitting together, sharing ice cream, watching their daughter laugh, felt like a step in the right direction. After a few moments of comfortable silence, Melissa finally spoke. She likes you, she said, her voice softer than before. Andrew turned to her, surprised by the admission. You think so? Melissa nodded. She's a cautious kid. She doesn't warm up to people easily. But she trusts you already. Andrew swallowed, feeling the weight of those words. He had spent his entire life earning the trust of business partners, employees, investors, but this was different. This was real. This was something that mattered in a way nothing else ever had. I don't take that lightly, he said, his voice low but firm. I meant what I said, Melissa. I'm not going anywhere. Melissa looked down at her ice cream, her fingers tightening around the cone slightly. I want to believe that, she admitted. But I can't afford to just take your word for it, Andrew. It's not just about me anymore. It's about her. I have to protect her, no matter what. Andrew nodded, understanding more than she knew. He had never been the type to ask for second chances. He had always believed that once a door closed, it was better to move on rather than dwell on what could have been. But this was different. This wasn't just about fixing a broken relationship, it was about showing his daughter that he was someone she could count on. You don't have to believe me yet, he said finally. I'll show you. Melissa met his gaze, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but she must have found none because after a long moment, she nodded. Okay, she said quietly. We'll take it one step at a time. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Sophia suddenly interrupted their conversation, holding up her now empty cone with a triumphant grin. All done. Andrew chuckled. That was fast. She nodded enthusiastically. Mommy says I eat too fast, but I don't like when it melts. Melissa rolled her eyes playfully. And yet, somehow, you always end up covered in it anyway. Sophia giggled, and without thinking, she reached up and took Andrew's hand again, swinging it slightly as she looked up at him with a smile. Can we come back here again? Andrew felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. Of course, sweetheart, he said. Whenever you want. She grinned, clearly satisfied, before letting go of his hand and running toward a nearby tree to chase a squirrel that had caught her attention. Melissa stood, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. We should probably get going soon. Andrew nodded, not wanting the moment to end but knowing he couldn't push too hard. Can I call you later? Melissa hesitated, then gave him a small, cautious smile. Yeah. You can call. It wasn't much. But it was a start. As he watched her walk away with Sophia's small hand in hers, Andrew felt something shift inside him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about work, about deals, about the next big thing. He was thinking about bedtime stories, about little hands covered in melted ice cream, about the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing through the park. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he wanted. Andrew spent the following week trying to focus on work, but his mind refused to cooperate. The contracts, the emails, the endless meetings that once defined his days all felt like background noise now. His thoughts were consumed by Sophia, by the way her small fingers had wrapped around his hand so trustingly, by the way she had laughed on the swings, by the cautious but hopeful look in Melissa's eyes when she had told him they would take things one step at a time. He had spent years believing he had built a life that meant something, that success was measured in numbers and deals, but now, sitting in his office with an untouched cup of coffee going cold on his desk, he realized that nothing he had accomplished meant anything compared to the moment his daughter had looked up at him and called him Daddy. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he left work early. His assistant had looked at him in surprise when he grabbed his coat and muttered something about having somewhere more important to be, but he didn't bother explaining. He wasn't used to this, putting something other than his business first, but it felt right in a way he hadn't expected. He had promised Melissa that he would prove himself, and he intended to keep that promise. When he arrived at their apartment building, he hesitated outside the door for a moment, taking a deep breath before finally knocking. He wasn't nervous about seeing Sophia again, if anything, the thought filled him with warmth, but he knew that Melissa was still watching him, still waiting to see if he would follow through. A few seconds later, the door opened, and there she was, standing in the doorway with a look of surprise on her face. She hadn't been expecting him. "Andrew?" she asked, glancing at the time on her phone as if making sure she hadn't somehow lost track of the day. "What are you doing here?" He shifted slightly, suddenly aware that he should have called first, but he hadn't wanted to give her time to find a reason to say no. "I just wanted to see Sophia," he admitted. "If that's okay." Melissa hesitated, studying him carefully, but before she could answer, a small voice came from behind her. "Daddy?" Sophia peeked around her mother's leg, her bright blue eyes lighting up when she saw him. Without waiting for permission, she ran straight toward him, throwing her tiny arms around his leg in a way that made his throat tighten. He crouched down, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I missed you." Sophia grinned. "Mommy and I were making cookies," she announced proudly. "But I ate too much dough, and Mommy said it would make my stomach hurt." Andrew laughed, glancing up at Melissa, who sighed. "I tried to stop her, but she has no self-control when it comes to sugar." Sophia giggled and grabbed his hand. "Come see. We still have some left." Melissa hesitated for only a second before stepping aside, allowing him to follow Sophia into the kitchen. The counter was a mess, flour dusted across the surface, chocolate chips scattered around, and a tray of slightly misshapen but clearly homemade cookies cooling near the stove. The sight of it, of this warm and simple scene, made something unfamiliar settle in his chest. "Did you help make these?" he asked, letting Sophia pull him toward the counter. She nodded enthusiastically. "I mixed the chocolate in, but Mommy did the hot part." Andrew picked up a cookie, studying it as if it were the most important thing in the world, before taking a bite. It was too sweet, a little too soft in the center, but it was perfect in a way he couldn't explain. "This is the best cookie I've ever had," he said, meaning every word. Sophia beamed, clearly pleased with herself, and Melissa shook her head, though he could see the smallest hint of amusement in her expression. "You don't have to lie to her, you know." "I'm not," Andrew said simply, meeting her gaze. "I mean it." There was something in the way Melissa looked at him then, something almost unreadable, as if she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he really was serious about this. But she didn't say anything. Instead, she simply turned back to the counter, brushing some flour off her hands. Sophia tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, can you stay for dinner?" Andrew felt his heart squeeze at the hopeful way she asked, her small fingers gripping his sleeve as if she was afraid he might say no. He glanced at Melissa, silently asking the question. She hesitated, clearly weighing the decision, before finally nodding. "Okay," she said quietly. "You can stay." Sophia clapped her hands excitedly and ran to the table, as if afraid he might change his mind if she didn't get him to sit down fast enough. Andrew followed, feeling an unfamiliar warmth settle in his chest. He had spent years believing that happiness came from achievement, from success, from winning. But now, sitting at this small kitchen table with his daughter beside him and the scent of homemade cookies still lingering in the air, he realized he had been wrong. Happiness was this. It was being here. It was knowing he had another chance. Andrew never thought that sitting at a small kitchen table, eating dinner with a 4-year-old and the woman he once thought he had lost forever, would be the most important moment of his life. But as he watched Sophia chatter excitedly about everything from her favorite cartoons to the butterflies she had seen in the park earlier that day, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a beginning, a chance to be part of something real, something he had never realized he was missing until now. Melissa had made a simple meal, pasta with homemade sauce and garlic bread, but to Andrew, it might as well have been a feast. Not because of the food itself, but because of what it represented. It was the first time he was sitting at a table with his daughter, the first time he was experiencing something as normal and domestic as a family dinner. For someone who had spent years eating in high-end restaurants or alone in his penthouse while reviewing work emails, this was something entirely new. And yet, it felt more right than anything else ever had. Sophia took a bite of her pasta, then turned to him with a curious expression. "Daddy, do you know how to cook?" Andrew nearly choked on his water, glancing at Melissa, who was hiding a smile behind her napkin. He cleared his throat and set down his fork. "Well, not exactly," he admitted. "I can make toast." Sophia gasped dramatically. "That's it?" Melissa finally let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You've really never cooked anything before?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Andrew shrugged. "I've always been busy. And let's just say the last time I tried, my kitchen almost caught fire." Sophia giggled. "You should learn. Mommy makes really good pancakes. She lets me help mix the batter, but I get flour everywhere." Andrew smiled, glancing at Melissa. "Maybe she can teach me too." Melissa arched an eyebrow, clearly amused. "I don't know. Teaching a 4-year-old is one thing, but teaching you? That might be a challenge." Andrew smirked. "I'm willing to try." Sophia clapped her hands. "Yes. Then we can all make pancakes together." The ease of the moment caught him off guard. He had expected this dinner to be awkward, filled with unspoken tension and hesitance, but instead, it felt natural. He wasn't just some outsider trying to fit into their world. He was part of it, even if only in the smallest way. After dinner, Sophia excitedly declared that she wanted to show him her favorite bedtime story. She grabbed a book from a small shelf near the couch and ran back to him, holding it up as if it were a treasure. "Mommy reads this to me before bed. It's about a little girl who finds a magic star and makes a wish." Andrew took the book from her hands, studying the worn edges of the pages, the way the corners had been bent from being read over and over. He glanced at Melissa, who gave him a small nod, silently giving him permission to stay a little longer. His chest tightened at the gesture. Sophia grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the couch, settling herself beside him as he opened the book. She leaned against his side, completely comfortable, as if this had always been part of her routine. As if he had always been here. He swallowed the lump in his throat and began to read. Melissa sat across from them, watching quietly as Sophia listened with rapt attention. Andrew could feel her gaze on him, but he didn't look up. He was too focused on the warmth of his daughter against him, the soft rise and fall of her breathing, the way her fingers absently played with the hem of his sleeve as she listened to his voice. By the time he reached the last page, Sophia's blinks had become slower, her grip on his arm looser. She let out a small yawn and snuggled closer. "That was a good story," she mumbled sleepily. Andrew closed the book, his heart aching in a way he couldn't describe. It was, he agreed softly. Melissa stood and walked over, gently brushing Sophia's curls back from her face. "Come on, sweetheart," she murmured. "Let's get you to bed." Sophia whined sleepily but let her mother scoop her up. As Melissa carried her down the hall to her bedroom, Andrew stood, rubbing a hand over his face, trying to process everything. He had expected to feel like an outsider tonight, but instead, he had felt something else entirely. He had felt like a father. A few minutes later, Melissa returned, crossing her arms as she leaned against the doorframe. "She was asleep before I even finished tucking her in," she said with a small smile. Andrew nodded, unsure what to say. He wanted to tell her how much this night had meant to him, how much just being here, sitting at that dinner table, reading that story, had changed everything for him. But the words felt too big, too heavy to say out loud just yet. Melissa studied him for a long moment before finally speaking again. "You did good tonight," she said, her voice softer than before. "She's happy. That means something." Andrew met her gaze, his throat tight. "I just want to be there for her," he said. "For both of you." Melissa hesitated, then sighed. "I'm still scared, Andrew," she admitted. "I've had 4 years to figure this out on my own. Letting you in, it's not easy." He nodded, understanding more than she knew. "I don't expect it to be," he said. "I just need you to know that I'm not going anywhere." She exhaled slowly, then gave him a small, almost reluctant smile. "Good." It wasn't everything. But it was enough. As he left that night, stepping into the cool air of the city, he knew one thing for certain. He had spent years thinking he was chasing the right things, that success and ambition were all that mattered. But now, for the first time in his life, he understood what truly did. And he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers again. Andrew had never been the kind of man who believed in fate. He had always thought that life was about choices, about taking control of your own destiny and shaping it into what you wanted. But as he stood outside Melissa's apartment building, waiting for her to open the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that some things were meant to happen no matter how much time had passed. He had spent years chasing success, thinking that achievement and ambition were what defined him. But now, as he heard the soft sound of footsteps on the other side of the door, he realized that everything he had ever truly needed was standing right in front of him. The door opened, and Melissa appeared, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. There was a softness in her expression, a quiet hesitation, but also something else, something that told him she was no longer waiting for him to prove himself. He already had. Sophia's voice rang out before he could say anything. "Daddy." He barely had time to brace himself before she threw herself into his arms, her little hands wrapping tightly around his neck. He caught her effortlessly, lifting her up as she giggled against his shoulder. He held her close, letting the warmth of her small body sink into him, and in that moment, he knew there was nowhere else in the world he would rather be. Melissa stepped aside to let him in, and he followed her into the living room, still carrying Sophia, who seemed perfectly content to stay in his arms. "I made something for you," she announced proudly, squirming until he set her down so she could run to a small table covered in markers and construction paper. She grabbed a folded piece of paper and ran back, holding it up to him with an excited grin. Andrew took it carefully, unfolding it to reveal a child's drawing, crayon lines forming 3 figures, a tall man with curly hair, a woman with long brown hair, and a little girl in the middle, holding both their hands. Above them, in wobbly letters, was one word, family. His throat tightened as he stared at it. Of all the things he had accomplished in his life, nothing had ever mattered as much as this simple drawing. He looked at Sophia, who was watching him eagerly, waiting for his reaction. "This is amazing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to keep it forever." Sophia beamed. "I made it because now we're a family again." Andrew felt his chest constrict as he looked over at Melissa. She held his gaze for a long moment before offering him a small, almost shy smile. "She asked me if you were going to stay," she admitted softly. "And I told her I think you finally found what you were looking for." Andrew exhaled slowly, nodding as he crouched down so he was eye level with Sophia. "I did," he said, reaching out to tuck a curl behind her ear. "And I'm never leaving again." Sophia threw her arms around his neck, and he closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting himself feel the weight of this moment. It wasn't just about showing up anymore. It was about staying. About proving, every single day, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Melissa watched them with something unreadable in her eyes, but when he stood, she didn't look away. There was no longer hesitation in her gaze, only quiet acceptance. He had spent years thinking he had lost her forever, but maybe, just maybe, some things weren't meant to be lost at all. "I was thinking," he said carefully, glancing between her and Sophia. "Maybe we could do something together this weekend. Just the three of us. Like a real family." Melissa's lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her face, but then she smiled, a real, genuine smile, the kind he hadn't seen in years. "I'd like that," she said softly. Sophia gasped in excitement, clapping her hands. "Can we go to the zoo? I want to see the penguins." Andrew chuckled. "The zoo it is." Melissa shook her head in amusement, but there was warmth in her expression that told him everything he needed to know. They weren't just cautiously stepping toward something anymore. They were already there. That night, when he left their apartment, he didn't feel like he was walking away. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he belonged. And no matter what it took, he was never going to let it go.